Betsey, great to have your perspective here this morning, because we've got a lot of conflicting jobs data. So how do we know what's going on, and what's your assessment of what's going on in the labor market?
Well, I mean, the first thing is we can't pretend that we're not missing data, because the federal government data that we're missing is a really important piece of this. It's great that we have the ADP data. Keep in mind, ADP is a huge business. They have almost 500,000 companies that rely on them for payroll processing, which is why they can cover give us information on what's going on in the labor market. About 26 million Americans get their paycheck processed through ADP, and their data tends to be correlated but not perfectly predictive of what we would be getting from the BLS. And what we're seeing from ADP is we have ongoing job growth, but it is much, much slower than what we had before. And then we're putting this in, together with data that says that we're seeing a pickup in some amount of layoffs. I don't know how much stock I would put on that just yet. I think what we're seeing in the labor market is a labor market where hiring has dramatically slowed. So if you have a job, great. And I don't think that there's a ton of risk that you're going to lose it. But if you do lose it, you're kind of in more trouble than you would have been, say, a year or two ago, because we're not seeing a lot of hiring. And so it's going to be harder to find that job. For sure, what we've seen in the last 6 months is a decline in the dynamism of the economy, meaning there's a slowdown in businesses forming, businesses hiring people, and all of that leads to a slowdown in the labor market.
And we do have, in terms of data, we have the weekly unemployment benefits coming from the states, right? And that, again, doesn't show us a lot in terms of clarity in what's going on. And in any case, that's more on the losses side of the ledger, not the hiring side of the ledger that you're talking about. But, the stuff that we do have like that, what is that also telling you about sort of labor market demand out there?
Well, we always see that some people lose their jobs. And it can be very hard in those weekly claims without a longer time series to really see, are we really seeing a pickup in layoffs? As I said, I think there is some suggestive evidence that we're seeing a little bit of a pickup in layoffs, but not one that I would necessarily say is makes it time for us to panic. I think the bigger problem for American consumers, as they're taking a look at what's happening around them, the labor market's slowing down, so it's harder for them to find a new job, maybe to get that raise that they want, to make a transition. They're at a slightly increased risk of losing their job. And they're going to the grocery store, they're shopping for, maybe getting that early start on shopping for Christmas, and they're seeing higher prices. And you put that all together and nobody feels good about that. Rising inflation and a slowing labor market is a recipe for a really uncomfortable economy.
Betsey, we've talked about before also the split in the economy, and looking into the University of Michigan sentiment numbers that I just mentioned, where the numbers are not good, right? People don't feel good, to your point. One interesting thing, according to the release, consumers with the largest tercile of stock holdings posted an 11% increase in sentiment as we've seen markets go up. And as we see, can those folks keep the economy afloat? And if so, for how long? And how long before their sentiment starts to roll over?
I get asked this question a lot. Should we be worried about the fact that there is a small number of people who are doing incredibly well, maybe because they hold a lot of stock, so they're big capital holders and the stock market's doing great, maybe because they're just, very high earners and the top of the labor market's doing well? I think that there are problems when you have that K-shaped economy and there's a small group of people doing really well. I don't think the problem is macroeconomic volatility, like a risk of a recession. I think the problem is social cohesion. I think the problem is but the potential for social and political unrest. Nobody wants to live in an economy where there's a tiny number of elites and everybody else can, barely hang on to what they have. That's not an economy that people want to be in. And I think we should be much more worried about what that means for the state of our nation than the risk of a recession.
Betsey, I also want to ask you about the shutdown. Kevin Hassett, the president's economic advisor, was on another network this morning saying that economic growth, GDP, in the last quarter could be half of what was estimated as a result of the shutdown. Do you think that's too dramatic to say, or do you think it will have that kind of a large effect?
I think that's too dramatic to say. You know, we can go back to past estimates and we can see what kind of negative effect there is. Some of the negative effect is a little bit mechanical. In other words, it'll get made up in the next quarter, because if we open the government back up and we pay those government workers, then we're going to get that money, back into the economy. I think the bigger issue with a shutdown is the stuff that's actually not going to be measured in GDP. Right? We've seen the airlines are working overtime to try to figure out how to cancel flights in a way that causes the least disruptions to their passengers, to their business. We see there's a lot of people out there, whether they're government workers who had to do this before the shutdown, or whether they're private sector workers scrambling right now, trying to figure out how to optimize in an economy where the government shut down. That is a waste of people's time and attention. And I'd really like them to get this government back, opened. But it is worth saying they're fighting over something very important, which is, what should health insurance cost people when they can't get it through their employer and they're buying it on the exchange? That seems to be a really big issue for people's pocketbooks.